I was, for a little bit, very seriously concerning bringing up, or ranting about, really, a argument that I had last night with somebody online. But they're not here to defend themselves. They're not here to represent their side, and I do not want to risk strawmanning their argument by misrepresenting it. So what I'm going to do instead is talk about one specific aspect of the argument and give my opinions on that. Because, got to make some content, right? So we're talking about character death. Obviously, you've seen the title. You clicked on the link. You know what this is about. We're talking about character death, player character death, and how it fits into RPGs and how perhaps to handle it well. So the approach that I took when I was writing Song and Steel is kind of adjacent to traditional RPGs where your character can die if things go very badly. And, if everything goes sideways, your character can die. At which point you make a new character. Easy enough. And that is in part due to the type of gameplay that I am trying to evoke. I want Song and Steel to feel at a surface level like the way that D&D is imagined to be played. And that is an important part, is that character death is a risk that you take. It is a thing that can happen, and you try to avoid that. But I did put in a little extra thing, an allowance for characters who are on the verge of death to have their heroic moment, to make their heroic last stand and then die at the end of the scene. I wanted that in there very intentionally, because I think that giving players agency in the death of their character is an important thing to have in a modern RPG. And for my next project, I will probably be having character death be something that the player has to opt into. Like, it can't happen accidentally. In Song and Steel, you can opt into death. It might hypothetically, it's very unlikely, it could hypothetically happen without the player choosing it. Things have to go completely sideways for that to happen. In my next project, it will be completely voluntary. It'll be something that cannot happen without the player's consent. And I think that is probably the preferable design. Fabula Ultima does a very similar thing where when a character is reduced to 0 hit points, you have to choose to either surrender or retreat. I think that's what it is. If you retreat, you leave the scene and you'll rejoin with your companions in the next scene. If you surrender, your character dies. I think no, sorry. That's the rules for villains. Villains can either retreat or surrender. No, for player characters, it's surrender or sacrifice. So surrender means like I'm out. I'm down and out. I can't continue anymore, and you are out for the scene. For sacrifice is what it is. Your character gets to make a heroic sacrifice, like, save someone's life or what have you, and then they die. And there's stipulations on this, on when you can do it. There has to be a villain, it has to be like 2 out of the 3 conditions have to be true. So like you have to have a villain in the scene, or believe that your sacrifice will help someone that you care about or make the world a better place. It has to be like 2 out of the 3. And I think that kind of thing, like not necessarily that specific mechanic, but that kind of approach to character death where it's always voluntary. Like you can't, like in Fabula Ultima, players cannot die unless the player chooses for their character to die in a sacrifice. That's the only way for characters to die. They cannot die any other way. And I think that's probably the best way to do it in a modern RPG. If you're not specifically going for like an old school dungeon crawl type thing, having character death be an opt-in mechanic is, I hesitate to use the word enlightened because that sounds a little pretentious, doesn't it? But it definitely does seem like the very modern approach, and there's a lot of good reasons to do it that way. Players invest a lot in their characters. Players they develop their backstory. They engage with the game via their characters as an avatar. And it can be like an extension of themselves, or it can be, something completely different than themselves. Whatever it is that they are doing with their character's relationship to themselves as a person, the character is their interface into the game world. And so by having characters be valuable and durable, it ensures to the player that like this interface, this story, this a way to approach the game is ensured. Therefore, you can have great engagement with the game. I can be terribly strongly invested in my character and their relationship and place in the world, because I know that I'm not going to just randomly lose them to some, throwaway, wolf encounter, So that's the big advantage, is that by assuring to the players that your characters are durable and they cannot just randomly die, it encourages them to double down on that investment. If my character it can just die at any moment. If a random orc arrow ambush hits me in the head, crit, oh, I'm down, character dies. If that can just happen, then like, why bother making a lot of investment into the character until I have the tools to ensure that does not happen? So that's the big thing. Also, there's a certain amount of like, you've heard me talk a lot before about player agency and ways to enhance and encourage that. And I think having some measure of control over your character's death is probably the best way to have player agency. I'm very distracted by this car that just pulled up next to me. All right. It's nothing. Don't worry about it. Where was I? Player agency. Yes. Giving players, even just any amount of measure of control over when their characters die really gives the player that golden button that they can push. Like, I am deciding now as a player that my character should die in this situation to accomplish whatever goal. This is worth dying for. And that makes a great moment in the story. Whereas if character death is entirely just up to the dice, functionally random, obviously there's non-random elements, but like if it's entirely up to the dice, like random deaths are going to happen a lot more often than those like really story important heroic deaths. I'm not saying they don't happen, but the random ones, the ones that are meaningless, the ones like throwaway characters, oh, I made the character and died the same day, that kind of death is going to be a lot more common than the ones that are narratively satisfying. So, now, some people may argue, and some people in fact have argued, if you were part of that conversation, that by taking away the constant threat of death, it will reduce a player's investment into the role play. You're not going to behave as carefully. You're not going to take the situation as seriously if there's no threat of death. On the surface, I get where that's coming from. I get this idea that like, oh, well, if your character just can't die without your say-so, then why bother being careful? But in my experience, across a multitude of games, multitude might be an exaggeration, but across several games, that just doesn't happen. What does happen is that by taking away the pitfalls, the sort of the risk of random being screwed over and losing your character, by taking those away, players are a lot more interested in taking risks, in engaging with the world. If you're this kind of like old school, was it the OSR, the old school revival movement, where they've got the sort of adventures and game systems inspired by D&D First Edition. You've got any time you're in a room, don't touch anything. Don't eat it or drink anything until it's been identified. Don't touch anything. Certainly don't talk to people or make deals or anything like that. Just the risk of interacting with the world is so great that the player characters, in order to survive, need to play hyper cautious. You need to check for traps every 5 feet. You spend 10 minutes checking a door, because if you don't, a random trap might just kill you. Realistic? Well, I don't like the word realistic as it applies to D&D, because nothing's realistic in that context. But there's a certain logic to it. But what it does is it teaches the players not to interact with the world. And that's the kind of behavior I don't want to encourage with any of my mechanics. I want players to be encouraged to go forward and engage with the world, engage with the environment and the characters without fear of suddenly randomly losing their character. And I think that making death a purely opt-in mechanic is a good way to do that. I don't know that I have a lot else to say on this subject specifically, but I do want to add that, I don't think less of games that don't approach death this way. Character death is a significant part of any kind of narrative. RPG, novel, movie, what have you. Anything. And the way that it is handled is going to naturally be informed by the types of stories that you're trying to tell. So there isn't really a wrong way to handle character death, but there is a way that I prefer as a game designer because of the way that it interacts with player incentives. As Peter from Tales from Elsewhere, he recently did this really great video on player incentives and the way that different types of abilities can incentivize different types of behavior for the players. It's a really great video. Definitely go watch it. I will link it in my description. But the point that I'm getting to is that it's that kind of approach that I try to take with my game mechanics. I don't necessarily want what mechanic most accurately represents reality. It's what type of mechanic is going to encourage players to behave in accordance with the types of tropes and the types of stories that this game is meant to evoke. So that's why I take the approach to death that I do. So anyways, yeah, character death. It's a tricky situation. There aren't a lot of bad ways to do it. I mean, there are some bad ways to do it, to be sure. But the way that your game handles character death is probably going to be pretty indicative of the type of game that you're trying to make. And so it's largely a matter of preference, but also the mechanic that you use has implications. And so you got to be wary about what those implications are.